Uh, live transcript enable. Okay, so this is my tape comments on Kiss Me Deadly, so I'm going to switch to shared screen in a moment. I've got a few notes off to the side here. Let's try the shared screen first. Okay, share. Good. Now I'm up in the corner, and this is the opening shot of Kiss Me Deadly. Then go to full screen. Okay, so before I take this further, it's certainly instructive to compare the opening scene of Detour and Kiss Me Deadly, because both of them literally feature a road, they feature a car. It's that classic lineup of genres from different eras where there's so much, they're so alike and they're so different, or they're so different within a pattern of similarity. It kind of gives me a chance to explain yet again what genre is in a way. Genre uses things like expectation and disappointment to generate affect. So one reason genres work is we think we know what they are. We kind of know if we're in a melodrama or a noir or a western. Now, there is hybrid noirs where it's not so clear, but you know, by and large, it's fairly clear. And so within that field of expectation, feelings can be generated within us of excitement, anticipation, or disappointment. So anticipation, disappointment, excitement, disappointment, that those permit the creation of a kind of frisson, an emotional frisson. And if you've read my comments that are in the discussion tab, and I'm going to look at a few of them because I work with a book by Lauren Berlant called Cruel Optimism, which is an extended look at the particular ideology of America, especially in the 20th century and even more particularly post-World War II. Her title hints at her thesis, which is that America insists on a kind of optimism that the day-to-day realities of life within America don't really support. So the ideology of America is perpetually optimistic. We're getting better, we're improving, you can get ahead, hard work pays off. But over and over again, the realities don't seem to sustain this. I mean, you can find a rags to riches story, but even there, when you look more closely, I mean, do people like Elon Musk and even Zuckerberg, is that the American dream? I mean, there seems to be a lot of money, and that gets held up as some kind of eventual, revelation of wealth. But what cruel optimism really, what Berlant gets at, I think that's so, and Noir is such a great example, is that America's not the only country that does this at all. And we can fill in to the extent we think Canada might do this, but America seems, one of its defining features is this ferocious mortgaging of the future to pay for the disappointments of the present. And all of the Hollywood cinematic genres try and cope with this. Let's pick melodrama, since you've just worked with it extensively. How does melodrama mortgage the future to make the present bearable? We'll look at the ending of Now Voyager, where their present, which is that we can't get married, we can't be lovers, we will raise Tina as long as we sacrifice. It's all about the future. And when he says, will you be happy? She says, let's not ask for the moon, which would be sort of day-to-day happiness. when we have the stars, which I would read as the kind of idea of a present sacrifice that is assumed to lead to an eventual payoff. This is a very theological framework, that our reward is not here but in heaven. This is what the oldest ways we have of explaining, quote unquote, contextualizing and making suffering bearable, is that there's an unknown future we can't fully appreciate where this suffering will make sense. That's one way to help us tolerate suffering. The other way, which melodrama warns against and which film noir sort of encourages, is get what we can now. So Carol in American Beauty is ferociously wanting more and more and more. But the way melodrama sets it up is that's presented as the bucket with the hole in it. Like, Carol's never going to be happy, even if she sells one house, even if she sells 10, even if she takes one lover, even if she takes 10. The way she has set it up, this being satisfied is actually not an option. And you get into a loop where the more you pursue this thing you've been told will satisfy you, the deeper is your discontent. And then Ricky Fitz, pulls back on all of that and says, sitting watching a bag dance in the wind is the happiest thing that has happened to him. Notice there's no futurity. What is it he loves so much about the bag? Is it has no point, it has no ambition, there's no accumulation. There's only revelation of a kind of beauty that's easily covered up by day-to-day strivings to bring about a future that will that in a sense cash out the present, make the present, which is not now worth it, suddenly worth it. So melodrama says, can you do anything to make your present, the way it is now, already worth it? Can you, it's again an addiction model of sorts. Can you wean yourself from predicting a future that will make your present worthwhile? Because you're kind of set up in a perpetual, you're at the edge of a cliff of disappointment all the time. And that's why sacrifice is in some ways, it's more vague than investment, but that's also its strength in a funny way, because with investment, you can find out very practically that the $100 you invested's gone, or the $100 you invested came back and is now 150. And if you reinvest, maybe it'll go to 200, but that's still a kind of pointless loop. But the thing about sacrifice is that it can't really fail, because it projects something beyond this world to a kind of elsewhere. So as I pointed out with Detour, it opens with a rear view shot of the road disappearing. So going backwards into a future that you were not even shown. And there are frequent driving scenes where we're given his eyes as they appear in the rear view mirror. And famously, he will say at one point, the future couldn't be brighter if I embittered it with lights. And then that future dramatically disappears. And he insisted he was forced off the road. It was a detour. It had nothing to do with him. And he gets angry with us, the audience, the imagined audience. You're probably sitting there with your smug grins, but it probably could happen to you any day now for no reason at all. He really, it's literally a phrase, sticks out its foot and trips you. And that is something that connects us a bit to Mike Hammer, who is obviously the lead character in Kiss Me Deadly. Because on the one hand, they seem very different, just like this opening, which I'll get to shortly. Mike Hammer seems to be a paragon of obnoxious confidence, unfazed by what others think of him, not really interested in the welfare of anyone. I mean, he literally makes his living, and it's a little obscure. We sort of get an account of it by the police detectives who bring him in for questioning after he's been pushed off the cliff and is in his burning car by Dr. Soberin, and his gang, who are looking for the great what's-it, some kind of nuclear fissionable material that seems in danger of falling into the hands of either gangsters or maybe an international cartel. Soberin, because it's basically Soberin, the gangsters, the police, and then Mike, who senses some big payoff. He just assumes that the reason he's not, everyone's questioning him and no one's making it clear, what's in the box, that it must be really valuable. And so he starts sleuthing on his own, and he gets warned off by the mob and by the doctor and by the police. And all of this just makes him more determined that whatever this payoff is, it'll be great for him. What makes Kiss Me Deadly in 1955 a noir that's really trying to take in the madness of the Cold Wars is that the atomic bomb and the effect it had on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is so unmanageable, so beyond the comprehensions of modernity, that it risks destroying everybody. And it's not clear the police can tame it either. So on the one hand, Kiss Me Deadly becomes almost a standard. I don't know if you recognize the suitcase in Pulp Fiction, which also has a glow. It doesn't burn the person up when they open it. But that's been borrowed, Tarantino borrowed that from Kiss Me Deadly, because the thing that everyone's pursuing, whether it's the Maltese Falcon or the suitcase in Kiss Me Deadly or the suitcase in Pulp Fiction, it's the reason everyone's doing what they're doing, and it also doesn't matter. It seems to only exist as the thing that makes people strive and cheat and exploit and deceive themselves and others and to kill. But it itself seems, in a way, contentless. Yes, there's nuclear fission, and there's presumably money in the Pulp Fiction. Maltese Falcon is supposed to be a diamond-encrusted bird that's been covered with a black lead, and we're shown a scene where they hack at the bird and realize that it's solid lead. And the guy who spent his whole life looking for this priceless bird, he nearly has a nervous breakdown until he decides, no real evidence, that, this just must have been one of any number of fake Maltese Falcons that were designed to throw one off the scent. And he perks up immediately when he says, we must go back to Morocco and look for the real bird. So this idea that the object of desire is not what you desire, but what makes you desire. And in reality, we need the object to be what makes us desire, not to be the thing that we desire, because then the obtainment of it would extinguish our desire. And then we'd be left with the fact that, this didn't really solve our feelings of not being whole and not being complete. But we go through that all the time in commodity and consumer culture, where we occasionally do get our object of desire, only to have it kind of transform into something ordinary, and somehow something else that we don't yet have takes its place, because objects of desire don't survive our acquisition of them. Our acquisition of an object of desire eliminates it, disqualifies it to be an object of desire. We cannot both have something and want it. And what's more important is the wanting, and not the having. But we're inside a culture that insists on the reverse, that wanting must result in having. The whole point of wanting is to make it clear what you have to have. But wanting is being. Arguably, being, what does it mean to be? It is to feel wanting. You're wanting something, and then sometimes that's unpleasant, sometimes that's exciting. It's a lot like genre itself. We turn to genre wanting something, and then genre plays with that. It offers us, we feel like we're about to get what we want, and then we don't, and then we're disappointed. But the reinscription process that I've been describing at length, it's a little like that Maltese Falcon. We're disappointed when the melodrama doesn't bring about a newly sacralized world, but somehow the movie leaves us with a sense of, well, okay, this was the wrong bird, but the real bird might be out there. And maybe the next bird you find when you scrape off the black lead, there'll be diamonds underneath. And if not, well, then that's just not the right bird either. So no matter how disappointing it is, every time you get a bird and scrape it and there's no diamonds, it also, you flip from a profound disappointment, you thought you had your object of desire, to a new surge of purpose. Like, oh, it's another fake. Let's go find the real one. I mean, in a way, this is the plot of The Matrix, where Neo's looking for that real world behind the fake reality that the computers have generated. But the reason The Matrix isn't ultimately an existential, it sort of purports to be existentialism, but it's ultimately not, because it sets up Neo as a hero who's going to tear down this fake reality and restore real reality, which is, whereas the existential, as I mentioned, is to have an authentic life where you concede that there is no real reality behind the fake reality. All reality is fake to the degree that it rearranges what's there into an approximation of something that is significant and something that is moving forward toward a goal, which takes us back to the road. The road is such a powerful, the road and the car dominate film noir so much. They're barely in melodramas, because they're, noir is obsessed with trying to stabilize an authentic relationship to the great what's it. I mean, the real existential philosopher in Kiss Me Deadly is his girlfriend Velma. And she is girlfriend. She seems to think so. He doesn't really contradict her, but he doesn't really do anything that suggests that it's even a relationship, much less that it's going somewhere. I mean, the closest thing the only thing Mike Hammer gives Velma is he doesn't disabuse her of her idea that they're in a relationship, that deep down he loves her. But honestly, when you look closely, what is her evidence? Their relationship is painful to watch in a way. It's very cringy, because a more crass assessment is that he is her pimp in a way. He, acts like he's got some special relationship to her, but in fact, he wants her to go. It's not clear how far she's supposed to go with these guys. Like, does she have a few drinks and flirt with them? Does she make out with them? Does she have sex with them? It's left, well, this is 1955. And although they were getting a little bit out of the Hayes era, because I don't think this Kiss Me Deadly couldn't have been made in 1945 with the character that Velma plays. It would have been, she would have looked too much like a prostitute. She doesn't feel like a prostitute, and in a lot of ways she isn't. I mean, because she's not getting paid exactly she's doing it because she loves Mike. And there's one scene in particular which is a little perverted, really, where she's talking about how she ran into this guy, and that he knew something about the great what's it, and she says things like, "Does that do anything for you? Does that get your attention?" And she presented it as some kind of foreplay, and he's like, "Yeah, I want to know who killed Nick." Well, this is where Mike Hammer seems a lot like Al Roberts, because Mike Hammer killed Nick. I mean, obviously it was the gangsters who came and just released the car hitch, which then killed him by having the car crush him. But really carelessly, Mike says to Nick, "Yeah, can you find out?" And I can't even always remember the details of what it is, what kind of clues Mike discovers, because it's so contentless. It's so much not about finding the suitcase. And so he thinks, so Nick says, sure, I'll go ask around. And then he Mike's like, what'd you find out? And he goes, I didn't find out anything, but they sure were interested. And then the next scene, he's killed. So Mike just sent him to his death and he found no information, and it wasn't even an important errand. And we know that on a certain level, Mike is not just upset that Nick is dead, but trying to stave off the rather obvious conclusion that he set up the death. He didn't murder him, but he had him murdered in a way, because he shows up at Velma's in the middle of the night. It's like, does he have a key to her place? Well, I guess he must, but he just shows up in her bedroom, and she's trying to sleep off a hangover because she's been hanging out with these slobs who've been pawing her, trying to get information for Mike. And then he's like, Nick's dead. The hitch slipped and the car fell on him. And she's like, yeah, but what really happened? It's the closest she comes to kind of like, and the police captain will do this too. Like, everybody who you work with gets killed. And Mike doesn't learn anything. Al Roberts doesn't learn anything. They're caught in these perpetual loops where they're so effective at denying their own involvement in what happens, refusing to see that they are bringing about the repetition of a similar crisis over and over again. Why is it that whoever Al Roberts hangs out with winds up dead? Or whoever Mike Hammer hangs out with winds up dead. Velma, when he's off getting drunk because he's trying to drink away his sense of responsibility over the death of Nick, then that leaves Velma available to be kidnapped. And they come in, and he gets word from the bartender, and then he goes off to find Velma. So now she's the latest who's likely to die, having been associated with him. But the ending of Kiss Me Deadly, rounds on all of this and kind of shines the spotlight back on us. And Detour does this to a degree, but it's not quite as obvious, which is, aren't we all in the dilemmas potentially of Mike Hammer and Al Roberts? Isn't the American culture itself a disappointment, a kind of femme fatale that encourages us to compromise ourselves, to lose sight of our values, to become decentered and rootless, dangerous to people around us, dangerous to ourselves? Okay, so you've been looking at these bare feet, which is the opening shot of Kiss Me Deadly. And this is how the movie literally opens. So there's not even any credits. Notice how different this is than Now Voyager or American Beauty. Melodrama's really, it's almost like curtains open up, and either Lester's voiceover or the camera itself entering the Vale home, or Griffith's, overhead shots of the Chinese village. You feel a little like you are in a theater, and the curtains part, and you're like, oh wow, and there's a scene, and then your attention is drawn to certain things in the scene, and you're invited into this scenario of the movie, and there may be a conflict, but you're invited in. You're much more of a guest of the movie. There's a kind of existential barrenness in Noir. It opens in the middle of something. So even Detour, which has a kind of unauthored shot out the back of a car while the credits roll, but then we have this man stumbling down the highway. We don't know who he is. That's almost identical. Here's a woman running down the highway, also hitchhiking essentially, and needing to hitchhike desperately, which is somewhat true of Al Roberts. And so the highway almost becomes a parody of comfort and security. Like the people who are on the highway, they're either lost, or they're running away from something, or they're trying to flag down help, as in this case. And the road is so anonymous, it's so indifferent, it's full of gas stations and diners and, people that just pass each other, like even Haskell flirting with the waitress in the diners. He's just, he gives her a tip and she says, thanks a lot. And he said, sure, I'll be waiting for you outside when your shift is over, and ha ha ha. And then, he goes on his way, and there's something, and identity is so flexible when you're on the road. And Noir, Melodrama presumes that identity is stable. Charlotte is having a nervous breakdown, but there is a Charlotte who's having a nervous breakdown. Noir is seems very aware that the ego is a paranoid construct. It maintains itself by being constantly suspicious of all the things that might threaten it, which is pretty much everything. And that's how the ego maintains itself, by staying in a perpetual state of anxiety about being dismantled, which is precisely what having an ego is a constant. We talk about shoring up the ego, because the ego is constantly eroding, because it's at odds with reality. The world isn't centered on us. We don't have nearly the control that we like to think we do, and there isn't a day that goes by where we're not offered 5 or 6 clear examples that our ego is a necessary fiction, is a construction, and then we have to protect it all the time because it's not really in sync with what's real. It's an embroidering of a reality that shelters us from what's real. So it's constantly under attack from what's real. Melodrama doesn't go there at all. It assumes that the ego is the stable thing, that the ego is in sync, and it can be. Charlotte's been forced out of sync by her mother, but that's correctable. That can be fixed. She can voyage forth and align her ego with the larger world. So Melodrama presumes you can do that. Noir is clear from the outset that nobody can do that. And the play with identities, like this woman, she says her name is Christina, which maybe it is, but then she says she was named after Christina Rossetti, the poet who writes sonnets. She goes into the gas station and writes "Remember Me" on a piece of paper, which she puts in an envelope and mails to Mike Hammer, the man she's actually with, putting his address on it, which she saw on the steering wheel. Then tells him in the car, if we don't get to the bus stop, and he said, "We will." It's funny. You can sometimes, when you on a first viewing, people see Mike Hammer as they see him as confident, but they don't see him as deluded. His confidence is delusion. He's never right about anything, but it doesn't faze him. He's one of those people who, by never losing confidence, even when they're not right about anything, they start to seem like someone who's right about everything. Somebody like Trump comes to mind. And Mike Hammer is, this novel, Kiss Me Deadly, the film is based on a novel by Mickey Spillane, also called Kiss Me Deadly. He wrote 6 novels featuring his detective Mike Hammer. But Mickey Spillane hated this movie with a passion, because he saw something that not everybody saw, which is that Robert Aldrich, the director, and the writers are presenting Mike Hammer as toxic, as what we now would call a prime example of toxic masculinity. That phrase didn't exist back then, but he's psychopathically confident. He's misogynistic. He's a sadist. If you look at some of those scenes where he throws the guy down the stairs. Now, granted, the guy had a knife and was trying to kill him, but we're given a little smirk on his face, or when he breaks the Caruso record. It seems a small thing, but he enjoys letting people know that they're helpless, and he gets, as he tries to get information out of them. So Christina is running down the road. We'll find out later that she was put into insane asylum by Dr. Soberin because he had information about where the suitcase is. And the idea was to keep her there until they could get the information out of her. Now, notice how much sense does this make? Because after she runs away from the insane asylum and they get her, they don't take her back to the asylum. They bring her somewhere else and torture her to death and still don't get the information. Now, couldn't they have done that and not put her in the asylum in the first place? What's the point of the asylum? This is where you see a sort of a psychological allegory that if you run away from your persecutors, they will torture you to death. And then for some reason, well, I shouldn't say for some reason, that they see an opportunity to make it look like an accident. So, and there's no point in torturing Mike Cameron to death. He doesn't know anything. So they put him in the car and push it over the cliff so that it will look like accident. But then, oddly enough, even when it's pretty obviously not an accident, and Mike Hammer survives, and he must have told them, there doesn't seem to be a murder investigation that opens up for Christina. What's up? Why is this police guy just kind of ignoring that? And then, so there are very odd, in terms of realism, there's some really odd gaps in the movie. Maybe we can talk more about this in the open class. Because not the same way, but it's also a psychological allegory, like Melodrama, except here it's the necessity to face the terrifying authenticity of that existence doesn't have an intrinsic meaning, and the dangers of imposing meaning on existence, which you then will go to any lengths to protect. The atomic bomb, in some ways, and the feeling in post-World War II America is that the world had been made safe by this war, by the dropping of these two horrific bombs. There was certainly aggressive propaganda that it was an example that the right country had won, America, that they were now the unchallenged superpower. Russia didn't get a bomb until 1949. And so that's the start of the Cold War, which is in full swing by 1955. Also, the McCarthy hearings are going on in the mid-50s, where McCarthy has convinced people that communists have infiltrated every level of government. It's not that there weren't any people sympathetic to communism, even some in government, but the idea that it was about to bring down the democracy was not particularly valid, and then McCarthy used it to smear everybody and become the most powerful man in Congress in the Senate for about 2 years before it just started to fall apart. That this many people couldn't have been involved, can't be involved in this quote unquote communist plot. So it was paranoia. McCarthy, in a way, played the role of the classic paranoid ego, seeing enemies everywhere and making that a kind of strength. So not only do we not know what's going on, think about this from the point of view of the audience. We hear this heavy breathing, which is a really interesting use of the audio, and then we get a kind of we get the song by Nat King Cole. I'd rather have the blues than what I've got. And what he actually has is not clear, but it's a perfect song because there's a feeling beyond the blues. The blues are something you can maybe work with. You have the blues because your girlfriend left you, or something you are trying to work through with the song. So when Nat King Cole sings, I'd rather have the blues, I'd rather have something I could kind of work with and work through than what I've got, which is, I would argue, in this, it could be any number of words, what he's got is anxiety and paranoia and just a feeling of dread and not knowing where it's coming from or why. So that could be a song for the country at that time. I miss a kind of feeling that seems manageable, that I can attribute to actual events and to work through. The anxiety after Russia tested test exploded, a successful nuclear bomb in 1949, really put stress, an immediate, almost whiplash stress on the exuberance of post-World War II America that went from unchallenged power to, since there was the possibility of intercontinental ballistic missiles or ICBMs, you could be incinerated at a moment's notice. And if you look at some of the things that were available at the time, some of the videotapes and so on, people were encouraged to build fallout shelters in their backyard. Or there was a famous, I'll put the clip on for you, called Duck and Cover, where a friendly cartoon of a friendly little turtle going along, and this was for children, and the song was Duck and Cover, which is something I saw growing up, and kids scrambling under their desk, because obviously a 1-inch thick piece of plywood is going to protect you from a nuclear bomb. I mean, I was in 3rd grade, and I thought that was crazy. It was like a cult ritual where we all got under our desks, and I'm like, what the hell? You know, what is this? Doesn't do anything except promote the delusion that doing something is the same as protecting ourselves. And I ventured that opinion at one point. I got sent to the principal, and thus began my career as a professor. But it wasn't clear. I didn't know I was being sent to the principal. The principal didn't know what to say. It was very Beckett-esque. I got sent to the principal because I did something wrong, but no one knew what, and I was going to be sent back because they all knew I was sorry that I had done this thing that they couldn't explain. So I hadn't even read Waiting for Godot yet, but I lived it. And anyway, the visuals of this opening reproduce that sense of dread, imminent danger. This woman is terrified, and it's a brilliant choice to use the soundtrack of her gasping. And you still have a song, but it's not a soundtrack. It's what we call ambient music. It's coming from the radio. We'll hear it later when the woman's singing it in the bar where he's gone to get drunk to try and forget about Nick. So the song kind of follows him, and it's not unlike Detour, right? Where he said that tune, you try carving out some part of your brain and someone plays that tune and you're back again. So the mnemonic quality of songs, I mean, this is about triggering. This is a kind of very pedestrian, when you hear a song and it reminds you, and it might well remind you of something nice, it's still technically a triggering moment where something that's in the present sends you back to the past. And of course, if it's the favorite song from a painful breakup, that may not be so pleasant. But a lot of noir is about how difficult it is to live in the present moment, and yet also how vexed our strategies for making the present moment tolerable are, because they like addiction, they seem to offer short-term relief. And in Kiss Me Deadly, the whole movie seems to be hinging on, when we get to the great what's it, or Godot, or the Wizard of Oz, everything will make sense, and there'll be some kind of reward. Let me just play this a little bit for you, if I can. Hold on. That's a lot of buildup. Okay. So, several cars just drove past her, and the road is a very lonely place too. It's a place where you go in anticipation, a place where you want to be taken to a much longed for conclusion to your wanting. But this shot, just to close in on the still, notice he's not looking at her. He's concerned about the car. And this will come up later where he says, I'm sorry, I ruined your pretty car. And they have this entire discussion of toxic masculinity. She's like, I know, what kind of guy you are, and you probably do sit-ups to keep your belly hard. And he's not very interested in her analysis, but he doesn't particularly deny it either.
And now, fellas, we'll hear that fine new platter by Nat King Cole. Rather have the blues.
Chilly and conversation seems pretty silly. I feel so new and wrought. I'd rather have the blues than have.
So this is a very famous opening to any noir. The sort of half laughing, half crying, gasping. Out of context, it can be hard to locate. It could even sound sexual. It's sort of like soundtrack to something pornographic or something sexually explicit. But there's no words. It's just gasping and trying to breathe, panic attack, really. So this is an entire opening is just the sounds of someone having a panic attack as she struggles to get her breath back. And of course, we seem to have the opening of Detour again. So we are in fact now going forward, but it's pitch dark. Can't see anything in front of this car. We'll get this opening yet again in Lost Highway, the next movie, David Lynch, 1995, I think, where we're moving forward with the road, although this time the road just keeps disappearing under the tire. The yellow lines of the road just disappearing under the tire. So you still have a sense of time being devoured by this obsession with an imagined future.
You don't know what you're doing to me. The way it has got me caught. I'd rather have the blues than what I've got.
So even the lyrics here are very apt. Your web has got me caught. I'd rather have the blues than what I've got. The femme fatale in this movie, not as sexually evocative as, say, Rita Hayworth or Barbara Stanwyck from Double Indemnity, or Kathleen Turner later in something like Body Heat. Not as overtly sexual, but someone who makes herself sexually available as a trading chip. She calls herself Lily Carver, but she masquerades as Christina's roommate until the police captain says, we dragged her body, the body of Christina's actual roommate, out of the river. So who is this? And it winds up being the current girlfriend of Dr. Sober, and who's seeking information. Okay, let's push ahead a little bit to where we finally get a little conversation.
Where are you headed?
Los Angeles. Drop me off the first bus stop.
You always go around with no clothes on?
What's the trouble, officer?
Woman escaped from an asylum upstate. Young, wearing a trench coat.
Seen anybody up the road that fit the description?
No, I haven't, officer.
Okay, move on.
So Noir is less about plot and more about close-ups. This is a great close-up where she, he hears the profile of who they're looking for. It's her exactly, woman in a trench coat. And she reaches down and grabs his hand, and we see the malleability of identity on the road, that if he goes along with it, she can be his wife. And if even the fact that she's wearing a trench coat will not be sufficient, because what guy's going to pretend that a woman who's escaped from the asylum is his wife? Well, my camera will do it because he is curious. Well, it's hard to know what he wants at this point. Is he interested in her? Is he interested in her sexually? Is he interested in? Because it's not at all clear at this point that she would lead him to any kind of profit. But then again, my camera makes his living by exploiting relational situations. So he's getting Velma to seduce the guy so he can show evidence of unfaithfulness to the wife. I don't know if it was clear to you because it's a little confusing, but in 1955, at least, when you got divorced, there was no such thing as no fault divorce. A huge issue was who caused the divorce, and if you were labeled as the adulterer, and if a third party could be named as the one who alienated the affections, that was the phrase that was used, you might not have to pay alimony, the other person might have to. So there was a vested interest, if people were headed to divorce for whatever reason, to get the other to have evidence that their partner had been stepping out on them. So my camera's little shtick here, along with Velma, is to use Velma to generate compromising material with the husband, and then use himself presumably to lure the wife into a compromising situation, in which case the photographs would then be given to the husband. So in either case, the husband and wife are then armed with photographs of the other partner in a compromised situation. So it's certainly anti-relational to marriage, but it's also and it sort of puts money as more important than feelings and committed relationships. But it's important to note that the typical detective thing would be for someone to come to the detective, a husband or a wife, and say, I think my partner is cheating. I want to pay you to follow them and find out if it's true. So his shtick is interestingly different. He lures one or both partners into a situation they haven't necessarily sought out. Like Velma would just come up to you in a bar and sit down and be attractive and charming. And so you might stray, and you might even compromise your marriage vows, but you didn't actually set up the situation. So it's a kind of it's an incredibly cynical way to make a living, and that may be why he's perfectly willing to go along with this ploy until he figures out whether there's anything in it for him. And then just to back up a little.
Me? This wheel doesn't feel right. It keeps pulling over.
I have to tell someone. When people are in trouble, they need to talk. But you know the old saying.
What I don't know can't hurt me. This wheel doesn't feel right.
So that's a nice showcasing of that's essentially of a cliche. What I don't know can't hurt me. What you don't know can kill you. And the whole atmosphere of the Cold War is what you don't know could kill you. That you don't know if a nuclear missile's been launched. You don't know if your town could be incinerated. so the entire atmosphere is one of chronic paranoia. The scene where they're both tortured is done very quickly. There's no need for context. There's no coaxing. We don't hear any of the questions that she's given. We hear someone say she's passed out, and someone else says, I'll revive her. And then Dr. Soberin, who likes to trade in these mythological pontifications, says, well, if you did that, you would that would be Lazarus, and she would be coming back from the dead. And then we realize that she's been tortured to death. There's the expressionism of these scenes is incredibly condensed. So we just see a guy holding a plier, which stands in somehow for everything. And we only see her legs dangling, and we only see Dr. Soberin's shoes. In fact, this movie's obsessed with creating a sense of menace by constantly showing people's feet. In fact, he only knows to look for Dr. Soberin by checking shoes all the time. It's just, and at one point he says, don't look up. What would you see? Someone you don't know. So that idea that you never know who you're meeting. And so let me read a little from, just to orient these comments further. This is actually, I was working on this today for a larger article, so I've gone in again on an essay that I've already posted for you under discussions, but I added a little bit to it. This because I'm working on this for a book. So let me just jump in by showing a screen. It is also simultaneously a mirror reflecting backwards. Ulmer in Detour makes the following point. Al's ability to organize the shapelessness of his present into a temporal projection of hope comes to him courtesy of the silver screen, quote. So Noir, this is where Noir is aware of itself in a way as a movie. And Noir is hostile to genre. That becomes the basis of why it's recognizable and can even be called a genre, because it's relentlessly against any use of the screen to generate a renewed faith in an elsewhere that hasn't arrived yet. Now, to put this another way, the visuals during this voiceover make the counterpunctual point that Al's idle daydreaming of his future, that, quote, couldn't be brighter if it were embroidered in neon lights, actually is embroidered by neon lights. In fact, cinema. Think of a cinema's marquee with the title of the film and the names of the stars up in lights, or more specifically, embroidered by all the positive genres against which film noir pushes back. In that sense, film noir is the black hole of genre. It's the one that all the other genres, if they stray near it, get sucked in and disappear. In the example and scene analysis, the noir sensibility is generated by the counterpunctual stylistic technique of juxtaposing voiceover, the future couldn't be brighter, with visuals, the present moment perpetually swallowing itself in a rearview mirror. The combined effect of the audio and the visual is to generate what it feels like to live on and on and on in a present that fails to move forward from some recognizable starting point in the past, and therefore never approaches any nearer to some point projected into the future. Such an effect encompasses the feeling of what Lauren Berlant calls the cruelty of now. My analysis of this scene is intended to serve as an example of what she also calls conceptualizing affectivity. In this case, a central affective moment of historical consciousness in modernity, where temporal projections of hope into the future, intended to make the present tolerable, have begun to break down, and nothing arises in their place. Now, I think this is a whiplash we see moving from Detour in 1945 to Kiss Me Deadly in 1955. So only a decade has transpired, but in that decade, Russia has successfully exploded the bomb, and the Cold War has begun. Russia is helping China with its communist revolution. It's beginning to help the Viet Cong in Vietnam, and America is gearing up to push back. The Korean War also bursts out because Russia is helping the northern part of Korea to move into the southern part of Korea, and that war will lead to that partitioning, which is still present. The Korean War is sometimes called the Forgotten War, but 30,000 Americans died in the Korean War, and probably 1 or 2 million Koreans, and the result was a stalemate that continues to this day. So there was also a sense that the American dream, the future that couldn't have been brighter if it was embroidered in neon lights, that was 1945, 46, up to 47 when Russia exploded the bomb. And because in Detour, Al's despair is actually not that the world is a dark, hopeless place, but that he doesn't seem to be able to find his place in what should be easy street. Like, I just would get to LA and I would leave the car, I'd forget where I left the car, and I would go find Sue, and we would be so happy. And it's like, why? I mean, she wasn't happy before. What's changed? She doesn't have a job either. She's slinging hash. How does getting married clear all that up? You can see that Al in some ways seems to be almost a victim of genre. Like, he's getting more and more angry and disillusioned, but he's lived his life in accordance with genres, particularly romance. Because if we read that scene with Sue, it's a great contrapunctual scene where his voiceover saying, we were in love and we were an ordinary couple. There's nothing happening in that scene to support that. She's telling him, I'm leaving. She doesn't invite him. She mentions that maybe he'll come later, but she doesn't ask whether they could even talk about what it might take to either come now, or could she wait a few weeks and then he would come. It's a unilateral decision. I mean, she really is breaking up with him. And Detour is so kind of delusional that I think, as I think I mentioned in my comments for the movie, I think we're getting this cherry picking from Al's voiceover. He's very, very unreliable. He seems to, because really he looks truculent. And if you were to replay that scene, the scene would make more sense if she was saying things like, we're done. We tried. I'm leaving. Good luck. Goodbye. And it's maybe his own self-delusions. And same thing when he calls her again. Ulmer gives us a couple of frozen shots of her just staring at the camera. She doesn't say a word. We don't hear her say anything. All we hear is, that's the stuff. That's what I wanted to hear. No, don't try and stop me. And it's this bulldozer. It's like, this is all in your own head. And all because you get this $10 tip that you denigrated it from some drunk. But anyway, to go back to this, so what Berlant calls conceptualizing affectivity, in this case, a central affective moment of historical consciousness in modernity, where temporal projections of hope intended to make the present tolerable begin to break down. Nothing arises. As Berlant predicts, such a conceptualization of affectivity, quote, works illuminatingly and tracks the fraying relation between the post-Second World War state economic practice and certain post-war fantasies of the good life that are beginning to perceptibly crumble, end quote. So discovering that what you took to be the highway to our future is a lost highway going nowhere is, of course, the worst of both worlds. We will never arrive at the hoped for future, now exposed as delusional. And even worse, we remain trapped in our historical present. Only this time, we are stuck in it with no credible way to construct, quote, cushions for enjoyment, though our horde of idealizing theories and tableau about how we and the world add up to something, through our horde of idealizing theories and tableau about how we and the world add up to something, fantasies of upward mobility, job security, durable intimacy, meritocracy, mutual reciprocity, all of these pave the road to a desired future and make the present moment an experience of, quote, moving forward. The overwhelming contingencies of the present can be tolerated only if they are experienced as something, quote, on the road toward a desired future. So the road is perfect for this. We're okay with our present experience of on the road because we're not where we want to be yet, but the emphasis being on the yet. So driving on a road is a perfect visual and even psychological equivalent of how we cope with the contingencies of modernity. We kind of cushion ourselves from the cruelty of now by insisting that, like, if you're in a traffic jam, or this is I'm on my way somewhere. It doesn't matter how bad this present moment is, because this present moment is the only point of it is to get me to the future. But this is a dangerous game, because at what point do you finally begin to worry that maybe your present moment is all you have? And how do you feel about your present moment if you're not on the highway? And if you're already where you are? So when the belief in its desired future founders decide that the highway is suddenly a lost highway, and which is to say one that goes on, but can never arrive anywhere. Acceleration becomes pointless. Patience becomes futile. Making plans feels masochistic. Even doubling back is meaningless, since there's no way to tell where or when the highway detoured and became lost, or even if there ever was a path to one's imagined future. When the positive concept of a detour is, I'm off the main road, but this is taking me back onto it. But how do you tell the difference between the detour and the highway? That's that kind of almost a Zen koan that we encounter in film noir. Maybe what you think is the detour is the highway. Maybe what you think is the highway is the detour. Now, all of the other genres solve that question. Like in romance, you might be on your way to meet what you think is the love of your life, or you want to believe is the love of your life, and you bump into some random person, some waitress or something, and that's where the romance takes off, and you realize you don't really love the other person. It would never work out, and you have to be with this person, and so on. So your detour becomes your new highway. But in noir, you take detours because you want to get back onto the highway, and then you can't find the highway. So then you try and make the detour a highway, but you can't. And then you seem to see maybe a detour from the detour, but now what is that getting back to? So the highway gets lost in film noir, which kind of makes the point that in other genres, the whole point is to not lose the highway. Like, you can lose it for a while, but you've got to get back on. But in noir, you realize that the highway was always already lost, and that in fact it's a strategy of modernity to tolerate your present moment by fantasizing about your future, and that makes you prey to, among other things, predatory capitalism. One thing I've been reading, it's intriguing to me about the many things that COVID has brought up is, and I mentioned this I think before, but I'll just bring it up here in the context of noir, is that people are thinking twice about the jobs they used to have. So COVID kicked them out of a job they didn't love, but weren't really quite prepared to leave because they're dependent on the paycheck. So then they got kicked out anyway. There was even some limited relief offered, and they don't want to go back to the same job for the same price, because the strategy doesn't work anymore. That job was temporary, or that there was something else, something better coming around the horizon. Now a lot of people seem to be wanting to try and make their present better, and they're not content to tolerate an unfair, desperate present because they're told in some vague way that they're on the highway to something better. So Al's experience of traveling the highway goes from an exhilarating feeling that he is speeding towards a bright future to one where he is stumbling down this same road, locked into the cruelty of now. All capacity to project compensatory fantasies of a bright future have been stripped away. And arguably that's what we get by the end of Kiss Me Deadly, which is apocalyptic. Now, for years, Kiss Me Deadly, they ended with the house exploding. We didn't get the scenes of them stumbling toward the water, being halfway into the water. We didn't get the point of view shot of them turning around to see the beach house exploding. So there, in some ways, that ending was considered quite shocking. Like, is this the beginning of a nuclear? Like, how big is this explosion? It's begun with the beach house. Is it going to consume the beach and then the town and then the state and then the country? I mean, there's a kind of a there were lots of horror movies at this time, like Godzilla and various other science fiction horror of something coming that destroyed the world, which were clearly very much influenced by the fear of the atomic bomb, which was consolidated into a creature like Godzilla, who gets awakened from the bottom of the ocean and steps out and starts destroying cities. And not surprisingly, the first Godzilla movies were in Japan, the country that had suffered the Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the radioactive fallout that followed. So in the period leading up to and directly following World War II, an identifiable historical period that is contemporaneous to the decade of the classic noir cycle, the subject's world is fragile beyond repair, one gesture away from losing all access to sustaining its fantasies. For Al, this one gesture will be the completely unthought out impulse to give Vera a ride, the real crisis in both this time period and in the noir sensibility that represents collective affectivity is not that perhaps one is unhappy. This seems virtually a given. The real crisis is the sudden collapse of an imagined futurity in a present moment, one that occurs following just the one gesture. That'd be that amazing moment where he's once again thinks that I felt sorry for Vera, poor kid. Looks like she had a rough time. Her eyes snap open in the posture of the dead Haskell. What'd you do with the body? And explodes that future that he was fantasizing. The hoped for future at the end of the road we are traveling upon reveals itself as merely a compensatory fantasy. In one sense, this fantasy is real. The reality, however, is not in its substance, but in its psychological function as a buffer designed to offer this future, but also simultaneously keep it at bay in order to make, in an ongoing manner, an otherwise unbearable present tolerable. It's interesting that Al's full embrace of how pleasant it will be to watch Sue shoot to the top, as he puts it, serves as a catalyst for a proliferation of obstacles that spring up. Only moments after this reverie, it started to rain. This leads to putting on the roof of the convertible, the discovery of Haskell's body. Other mainstream Hollywood genres are temporal genres that typically present obstacles that need to be overcome, but it is clear the obstacles, while challenging, are not insurmountable. They can be overcome. What's so shocking about noirs, it says, no, we design these obstacles and we pretend that we can overcome them, but now either we can't, or when we do, it doesn't make any difference. So film noir shows the necessity for obstacles to be insurmountable, so we can postpone the realization that the apparent oasis of futurity within the desert of the present moment is a mirage. Another, film noir is associated with the urban, to put it mildly, and they use the cityscape, very much as a character. Again, there's no cities in any of the other, in any of the four melodramas we saw, or imitate both versions of Imitation of Life. They're not urban, and they don't. Well, the Cirque's version does a little bit, but the use of Bunker Hill, which is a site in Los Angeles, and the use of existing architecture, it's really well utilized. And the history of Bunker Hill is relevant because in some ways it's a timeline of film noir itself. Bunker Hill was initially, in the turn of the century, was the wealthy district of Los Angeles. So it was a hill, is a hill, and mansions were built on the hill, which looked over the rest of LA. But this was before Hollywood, before movies, and before the reservoir system that irrigated more of LA. And so by the time the 1920s, people were moving out of Bunker Hill, and these massive mansions were simply cut up into tinier and tinier rooms that were then for let. So a lot of the visuals of the Caruso guy, for instance, and also of Lily, so quote unquote Lily Carver, you get this this visual disconnect, because you probably have noticed the staircases are impressive. There's stained glass windows. There's a sort of a echo of a beautiful house, but there's also this grungy, grimy, slummy place, because all the rich have left, and now there's like 20, 30 people living in tiny rooms in what was once a family estate. So the architecture itself visually is constantly telling a story. So even as Mike goes roaming around the cities, Bunker Hill is the sort of the place that time forgot. And most of the people who wind up in Bunker Hill in the 50s, it's been gentrified again, but it became a kind of dumping ground of people who had failed, lost souls, alcoholics. Ray Diker, just compulsively smokes. We see constant close-ups of his ashtrays. All he seems to do is sit and stare at the door and shake and smoke, and that kind of frightening. Is Bunker Hill, because it's just filled with people who have somehow failed and don't know how to get back into even the illusion of a brighter future. So let me jump ahead to the point where this effectively becomes where the atomic subset becomes explicit. So if you notice the still, I'm beginning with this Mike Hammer with his typical arrogant smirk, and the police captain. And this is where there's a lot of tension here, because Kiss Me Deadly wants to retain this idea that the authorities are our last best hope. Like, this police captain doesn't seem particularly corrupt, but at the same time, Kiss Me Deadly and in Detour, you don't even see the police. They're presented though as this kind of hand of God. Like, one day, one thing I'm sure of is a cop car that I didn't thumb will show up, and I'll be, in the Hays Code kind of was an authority that said that, there is an intact social order and it is fair. And if you stray from it, you will receive punishments that correspond to the crime. But really, in Kiss Me Deadly, there's an uncertain feeling that are the police trustworthy? Is the government trustworthy? This is the Eisenhower era, but Eisenhower himself gave a famous speech where he warned against what he called the military-industrial complex. So as the president, he saw a kind of end run going on where the massive military contracts of multi-millions of dollars was teaming up directly with industrialization to produce arms races throughout the world, and to sell weapons in conflicts all over the world. And this was making even the presidency, possibly, or even the president, the Senate, the Congress, were less at the center of control. And I think this has continued. Like, the tension between corporations and government continues to escalate. Corporations are increasingly transnational, and they can avoid taxes by locating anywhere on the globe. And then they've got too much money to be seriously apprehended by government. And there's hints of that here. So this scene is uneasy because on the one hand, it wants to play out as, just give me the key, Mike, to this locker that has this nuclear fission. We've got to get this suitcase. We, the government, have got to get this suitcase back. But of course, the paranoia of the Cold War was that America did not have any way, and we're still living in this, to stop. I mean, it could try to make it hard for another country to develop the nuclear bomb, but it didn't have any absolute power. I mean, the current relationship with North Korea, I think they just launched some kind of missile the other day, or even the thought that Saddam Hussein might have atomic weapons, which led to the Iraq War. So there is a false comfort, as if, I mean, Kiss Me Deadly makes 2 points. One is nuclear fission is out there. Russia has got the bomb. Other countries are going to get the bomb sooner or later, either helped by Russia, maybe helped by us, or they may do it by themselves. And the possibility of constructing so-called dirty bombs, so by something that's not even a state, by by a group. So watch how this plays out.
Is it as important as Velda?
If you hadn't sent Velda out to do your dirty work, she wouldn't be in trouble. Now give me the key.
Will you make a deal for her?
Please, the key.
Sure, you'll make a deal for her. Like you did for Christina. You held her under custody in a hospital and you let her get away. You let her get killed. The way Ramondo and Kowalski were killed. And Nick. And maybe Carver too, for all I know.
Carver.
Yeah, surprised? What kind of an investigation you running around here anyway? Lily Carver, Christina Bailey's roommate.
We fished Carver's body out of the harbor over a week ago. You're so bright, working on your own. You penny-ante gumshoe. You thought you saw something big and you tried to horn in.
So let me get
What about this
a shot of
thing
a counter
who's
shot of
passing
his
himself off
face.
as Carver?
So this is the first time that Mike's confidence is starting to just break down. He keeps thinking he knows more than the police, and that he can work more effectively than they can. And that's continued. There are many detective shows you guys probably watch all the time of people who are more effective than the cops, and this is sort of the beginning of that the police are too bureaucratized to solve the crime, and so we need AWOL detectives with their own internal sense of justice to pursue it. So again, the close-up is oddly echoing the close-up of the hand where she reached out to hold his hand to pretend to be his wife. This is really nice, really well done. This is all silent, and it's all done with gaze. So he looks at the wrist. He looks at Mike. Mike looks at him. He looks at the wrist. He looks at Mike.
How'd you get that?
And Mike doesn't answer. First time in the movie, he doesn't have a wisecrack. And these are extreme close-ups. So we know we're at this kind of compelling moment. And this is where the policeman's going to sort of put his cards on the table.
Now listen, Mike. Listen carefully. I'm going to pronounce a few words. They're harmless words. Just a bunch of letters scrambled together. But their meaning is very important. Try to understand what they mean.
So I love this comment because this is sort of basic semiotics, basic deconstructionism. They're just little words. They're just letters that are arranged into little words, but their meaning is so important. And yet they won't really, the meaning won't be stated in separate terms.
Manhattan Project, Los Alamos, Trinity.
And now he's going to reach for the key and give it to him as whatever the meaning of these. I mean, he gets the fact that, okay, that suitcase is full of nuclear fission, and yet it's still not clear that what is motivating him to hand over the key, because on a cynical level would be, it's now impossible for him to imagine that there's anything in that suitcase that will do him any good. And of course, the Lily Carver girl will make that same mistake. What's in the suitcase? What's in the suitcase? And it's kind of curious that if Dr. Soberin hadn't been such a blowhard, he might have said, well, actually, it contains uranium. And if you open it, it will burn you alive. I mean, that might. Instead, he keeps saying stuff like, it is the Medusa's head. You are Pandora. She's like, you will unleash evil in the world. And she's like, never mind about the evil in the world. What's in the suitcase? And he seems to have really underestimated her. She couldn't care less about him. And he says, you do deserve half of the creature comforts you gave me, but I can't divide it in half. She says, well, then I'll take all of it. And then she shoots him, which he seems to have not anticipated at all. And then he goes into this desperate plea of, I'll tell you where to take it, but don't open it. But where is she going to take it? And is that place where and why would she take it there in the first place? So she's only, her self-interest is supreme. Anyway, here comes the key.
Let's go.
What about Velda?
What about her? What about him? Let him go to hell. Let the big slob sit there and think about his girl. What's likely to happen to her?
I didn't know.
You didn't know. Do you think you'd have done any different if you had known?
Now, if you recall, that echoes something that Christina said to him in the car, where he said, your thumb's not good enough for you. You have to use your whole body. And she says, would you have stopped for me if I just used my thumb? And he said, probably not. So the danger of a self-interest that is fueled by the pursuit of a futurity that is an illusion, that is the function of which is to make your present moment tolerable. That is what we see in My Camera. That's what we see in film noir, which is on the one hand, it's very specific to World War II and the immediate years following World War II. It's very specific to America, but it's also on a more universal Freudian level, if you will. It's about the way that desire in modernity has been harnessed into driving a pointless commodity culture that generates a carrot stick illusion of futurity to make an intolerable present moment. I've mentioned Squid Show and Squid Games, and some of you have seen that, which is that's sort of a noir. I mean, it is noir in a way. It's very, very post neo noir, but it's recognizably noir because it's about reaching that point where your illusions about the future that make your present tolerable are collapsing. And even though, well, I can't do spoilers, so I won't say, but winning the Squid Games isn't going to help. Let me put it that way. All right, so I'm going to go back. I'm going to stop the share and go back to me there. This is making me look like I got a sunburn tonight for some reason. I don't think I do. So I'll pause there. We'll have the open class. I did this tape before we had the open class on Detour because I'm trying to get ahead a little on my tapes. So we'll see, because the open class on Detour may enhance what gets said here. The next movie is Lost Highway, David Lynch, and it will be pretty clearly I think a remake of Detour on a much more hallucinogenic level. It'll be basically Detour from the point of view of Al's disintegrated personality, with the movie no longer supporting the veneer of a consistency that the main character in Lost Highway will be capable of, quote unquote, becoming someone else. And when he does, we'll recognize the woman who was his wife is now the femme fatale. It's almost like he enters a film noir in a desperate attempt to maintain a kind of toxic masculinity. So we'll have more to say about that later. I'm going to stop, and then I'll go through the process of making this link available to you. So bye for now. And I'll be seeing you this Monday to talk about Detour, actually, and then Kiss Me Deadly, then Lost Highway, then Memento. Then we'll go on to our last genre, the Western.